Human beings are pack animals. We want to do whatever it takes to please those around us, especially those we see to be on a similar or higher bracket of life to our own. There's a reason why people are so quick to defend their family members and friends, even celebrities and influencers, before knowing the full gravity of a situation. And yes, trust does play a hefty part, but that's not the exclusive reason behind it. When you have put someone on a pedestal, maybe it's one of emotional value, where you feel you know them better than anyone else and you have a strong urge to defend their name, that in your mind has done no wrong. This could be you defending a celebrity or an influencer after they've been exposed for committing heinous acts or just saying something controversial. Or maybe it's more intimate than that. Maybe it's someone that you've invested so much of your personal time and energy into. Maybe it's someone you love dearly. You may defend these people, yes, because to a certain extent you have faith in them to be a good person, but you also don't want to believe that someone you have invested so much of your trust, love, and energy into is inherently bad, maybe even abusive. The 2024 video game called Mouthwashing is a new psychological horror game that puts the player into a situation where they are forced to acknowledge the horrors of their own lives. The player is made to reflect on the biggest crime they most certainly have committed: the crime of compliance. Hello, my name is Addison and welcome to my channel. Today I want to talk about my current hyperfixation. As my friends can attest, mouthwashing has been taking over my brain for the past while, and I've had just such a strong urge to talk about it. So much so that I've actually written over 20 pages of information after playing the game not once, not twice, but thrice times. There's so much I want to cover that I'm going to have to make 2 videos. The one you're watching right now, the one that's coming out first, is going to be an in-depth summary for those who have either not yet played the game or may have had trouble understanding it. My opinion on the true order of events, and the meaning and symbolism in the game. Part 2 is going to be an in-depth character analysis of every character in Mouthwashing, where I also investigate their relationships to each other. Before I start this video, it must be known that the game, and therefore this video, deals with the following triggering subjects. These subjects include sexual assault and rape, suicide, cannibalism, the abuse of a disabled individual, as well as flashing lights and loud/grotesque sound effects. Please feel free to skip this video if you're not in the right headspace to deal with this right now. No one is judging you, and I hope that you subscribe for possible future content. Anyways, first I would like to talk about the events of this game. The crash. The game starts out with you controlling an unknown character. You are in the cockpit of a spacecraft that's carrying not only precious cargo, but a small crew of workers. One of the screens alerts you that there is an orbital body near the vessel, but it should be fine as long as you don't mess around with the autopilot. You grab a hold of the wheel and aim the spaceship directly towards the orbital body, and this isn't a mistake. You have to put in a key and press a button to override the autopilot, but you do so anyways. This causes all of the screens to turn red and sirens to go off. When you run into the hallway, the twists never seem to end, and you can hear a baby crying in the background. All the wires are out of the wall, it's sparking. You see the mascot of the space company, and all of a sudden you're enclosed by an encompassing light as you crash right into the orbital body. 2 months after the crash. Everyone in the small crew is sitting around a table, and we meet the cast of the game. They're debating if they should break into the cargo room in case there's something useful they can use to survive. There's Daisuke, the young and joyful intern who sees the break-in as the fun challenge. There's Swansea, who's a pessimistic older man. He's been with the company Pony Express for years and years. And there's a soft-spoken woman, Anya, who's the ship's medic. She wants to break into the cargo just in case there's any medicine or food. It is now revealed that we are playing as a man named Jimmy, who has been quick to take over the role of captain because something happened to the former captain. The captain did not die during the crash, but he had been so badly burned that he is unrecognizable. He is unable to move, talk, or communicate. Captain Curly is pretty much a breathing corpse, and the only thing stopping him from making sickening groanings all day are these painkillers that are rapidly depleting. 7 days before the crash. The screen shifts, so we're sitting in a chair in the medical office. The player is no longer in the perspective of Jimmy, but Captain Curly himself. He's getting his routine psych evaluation from Anya, but he seems to just be saying the same answers. Anya informs Curly that Jimmy has no longer been taking his evaluation seriously, and Curly says he'll talk to him because he has known Jimmy for longer. He finds Jimmy near the utility room, only to discover that the vent broke. Not only this, but Swansea's intern Daisuke had attempted to fix it, which resulted in the emergency safety foam spraying around the room. Curly opens the case for the emergency axe and gives it to Swansea to clean up the mess. He and Jimmy go down to the cockpit to have a more private evaluation. On the way down to the cockpit, the staircase becomes abnormally long and eventually leads to a drop. Curly drops down into the space-like platform, where he walks across it, and a bunch of ladders fall from the sky among emergency signs. Curly is engulfed in light before he finally makes it to the cockpit. It's clear that what has just happened was not real. It must have been some sort of vision or hallucination, because Curly does not acknowledge at all what had just happened. Through the evaluation, it's discovered that Jimmy did unspecified bad things back on Earth. Curly only got him this job because they are friends and he wanted to help Jimmy out of a rough spot. Curly confesses that he feels his job isn't enough to satisfy him. This just gives him another reason to have hired Jimmy for his crew. He likely sees Jimmy as some sort of rehabilitation project to give his life some sort of meaning. A letter from the company is faxed through, and we glitch to an advert about mouthwash before transitioning again to the next timeline. 2 months after the crash, the continuation. It turns out that the so-called precious cargo was actually just thousands upon thousands of boxes of mouthwash. Anya looks at the label and mentions that the high sugar volume makes it an unreliable disinfectant. Upon seeing the mouthwash, Swansea is filled with dread, knowing that the mouthwash has a high alcohol concentration. He instantly breaks his 15 years of sobriety and downs a whole bottle. 6 days before the crash. We're now playing as Curly once more, leaving the cockpit to tell our crew bad news. But just as Curly enters the lounge, he's met with a surprise birthday party. There's only one communal birthday party every year for the crew, and the crew decided that now was the best time for it. After making the cake, because he's the only one who's able to, everyone sits around the table, and Curly, because he's the captain, is asked to make a speech. Instead, he just breaks down and tells them the bad news. Pony Express is dismantling, and after this mission, none of them will have a job. Everyone freaks out, but once it calms down enough, Curly cuts the cake, and we glitch to another time. 3 months after the crash. We are playing as Jimmy again. Jimmy wakes up to the sound of an unmedicated Curly gurgling in pain. He goes to the cockpit to find Anya. There with her is Swansea, and they seem to have been talking about something rather personal. Anya jumps and cowers when Jimmy enters the room, and he immediately reprimands her for not doing her job properly. Jimmy goes back upstairs and administers Curly's painkillers before we shift to the lounge with an ethereal-looking Curly sitting at the table in front of a cake. He tells Jimmy to embrace moments like these before sending him to find a knife. Jimmy cannot find a knife, so instead he grabs the emergency axe. When he does so, the screen instructs him to feast. When he comes back upstairs, Curly is lying on the table. Jimmy approaches him and tries to chop him, but the screen glitches again before the blade even skims Curly. 4 months after the crash. We are still playing as Jimmy, and the screen instructs us to now check in on our crew. Immediately, when Jimmy steps into the hallway, he finds Daisuke completely inebriated on the floor. Daisuke admits that he only took the internship so his parents wouldn't think he was a complete and utter failure. It's clear that he really is just a kid when he says he doesn't know what he wants to do or what he wants to be. Anya, on the other hand, is sitting at the table. She's holding a container of mouthwash, saying that she wants to drink it, but she knows it will just hurt her. She also tells Jimmy that there is a locker obscured in foam that has extra medication. Jimmy degrades her for not telling him sooner. To break the foam, he has to talk to Swansea, who is so drunk he's dancing and singing. He smashes the axe into the day and night screen, which allows Jimmy to take it and get to the medication locker. He gives Curly his pain medication and acknowledges to him that being responsible for all these people and holding the title of captain is indeed very stressful. 6 hours until judgment. We are still playing as Jimmy, and he locks himself in the cockpit while Swansea yells and tries to open the door while threatening him. He manages to break the glass part of the door with the axe. 2 days before the crash. We are playing as Curly again, as Curly sits down next to Anya in the lounge. It's the middle of the night, and Anya has been up watching the fake night screen. She explains to Curly that there's now a dead pixel in the corner. And now that she knows about it, she can never truly see the picture the same. The dead pixel has fully ruined the illusion for her. Curly says that he only sees the bigger picture, and when you focus on the grand scheme of things, one dead pixel doesn't matter. After a pause, Anya asks why the medical office has a lock on it, but the sleeping quarters don't. And Curly suggests it's for the same reason the cockpit has a lock on it. For safety. 5 months after the crash. We are playing as Jimmy again. Daisuke runs to Jimmy to ask him for help. He tells Jimmy that Anya has locked herself in the medical room. When the two boys try to talk to her through the door, she's at first unresponsive, but then proclaims that she used to try to tell herself that an individual's worst moments don't define them, and that their worst damage doesn't make them beyond repair. She is clearly using this idea to cope with something. Then she says that she doesn't believe that anymore, and that she's going to, and I quote, finally listen to Jimmy and just do it. Daisuke lets Jimmy know that the only alternate route into the medic office is through the vent that he broke earlier in the game. In the room, no one is allowed to go in. They try to talk to Swansea, but he won't budge. He says that no one is allowed in the utility room because if the door is open, the change in pressure is bound to kill everyone on board. 8 hours until judgment. Daisuke is seen on the floor very, very badly injured. Jimmy needs to find a disinfectant, so he goes to cargo to find some mouthwash. When he enters cargo, however, it looks completely different. It's now a long path system of massive storage shelves. He has to navigate this route without being too loud, as this alternate version of the cargo room is the home to a giant blind horse that stalks him whenever he walks too loud. More ladders are scattered around here. Jimmy eventually gets the mouthwash out of the mascot's hand and uses it to clean Daisuke's wounds. 5 months after the crash, the continuation. In order to get access to the utility room, Jimmy decides that they have to knock out Swansea to steal the key. In order to do this, they make a spiked cocktail for him out of sweetener, mouthwash, and isopropyl, which, if you don't know, is rubbing alcohol. I think it's also important to note that 1 milliliter is toxic to humans if ingested orally, and Jimmy definitely used much, much more than 1 milliliter. Swansea drinks this concoction and ends up passing out, allowing the other 2 men to enter utility. It turns out that Swansea has been lying about the amount of foam. There was barely any compared to what he claimed. There was so little that one of the chiropods, which are the safety pods designed to keep a human being alive for 20 years, was fully undamaged. Jimmy is convinced that he was saving it for himself. Jimmy convinces Daisuke to climb through the vent despite knowing that it's broken and that he's likely to get really badly injured in the process. Daisuke protests, saying that they should wait for Swansea's guidance, but Jimmy convinces Daisuke that if he does this, he'll finally be able to impress Swansea and obtain the validation he craves. We can hear Daisuke hurt himself in the vent before screaming to Anya and asking her, quote, "What did you do?" 1 day before the crash. We are playing as Curly, and the game prompts the player to find the gun, with no context to why. Curly runs down to the cockpit and finds Anya kneeling on the floor in the middle of a panic attack. In shambles, she admits to us that she is pregnant. The captain starts to ask who, and Anya interrupts him to say, "Captain, I told you." And Curly responds with, "I've known him for a long time." Using this dialogue, it can be concluded that Jimmy has been sexually abusing Anya for some time now, so much so that she has reported it to the captain. Curly has been enabling this behavior of his close friend by not doing anything about the reported abuse. 6 hours before judgment. We are playing as Jimmy again. Daisuke is laying on the ground bleeding from the injuries he's obtained from falling from the vent. He's in a lot of pain as Jimmy and Swansea kneel over him. Swansea admits that he's always been a miserable old man, and despite always thinking that Daisuke was a useless ray of sunshine, he believes that he could have learned a thing or two from him. Swansea begs Daisuke to close his eyes before he puts him out of his misery with a lethal axe to the head. Doing this makes Jimmy scream at Swansea, calling him a sick monster. Jimmy now confronts him about the chiropod, and about him lying about the foam and utility. Swansea does not confirm or deny the accusation of saving it for himself, but he does say that Jimmy can go to the pod if he wants to. This is likely because Swansea was not saving the pod for himself, but for Daisuke. And because Daisuke is dead, there is no reason to keep on protecting it. Jimmy is instructed to take the gun, which turns out to be hidden in the drawer of the cot that Captain Curly is residing in. Leaning on this cot is Anya, who the audience now finds out has committed suicide through overdose. Jimmy turns around and sees Swansea running towards him with the axe. Day of the crash. As Curly, in the medical room, Anya tells us that she's told Jimmy about the pregnancy. She says that he walked away, and even bravely admits that she's not comfortable with him continuing to walk around freely on the spacecraft. Jimmy can be found next to the cockpit entrance, where he bluntly informs Curly that he only has two options. He can let the spaceship land normally and have to deal with the repercussions that he's allowed someone to openly rape a member of his crew, or the spacecraft could mysteriously crash, killing everyone inside, and he could remain the selfless hero. Curly selfishly chooses the latter, and Jimmy says he will take care of it before disappearing into the cockpit. This proves that Jimmy was the one to crash the ship, and he has been lying to the crew when he claims that Curly was the one to crash the ship purposefully. 1 hour before judgment. As Jimmy, we carry Curly to the table and lay him out in front of our disfigured crew. This scene is a moment of contrast to the birthday cake scene earlier in the game. Like Curly was before, Jimmy as captain is prompted to make a speech, and exactly like Curly does with the cake, he ignores the request and goes to chop up the meal. But this time, the meal isn't a poorly made cake, but part of the leg of the fully living and conscious Curly. They eat his leg to survive. The screen flashes with the word responsibility before Jimmy is spawned in a room with the same vent Daisuke hurt himself in. Jimmy jumps in and has to navigate a long and complex montage of vents and tunnels that can be best experienced through playing the game or watching a playthrough of it. I do have some clips on the screen because I really have no idea how to describe it. Eventually, Jimmy falls into a room illuminated with a spotlight. In the light, Swansea is bound to a chair, with the gun lying in front of his feet. We then shoot him in the face. We are transported into the room with a large screen playing an array of different peaceful footage. Swansea and Jimmy are both seen through silhouettes. Swansea admits that he was heavily addicted to alcohol for 13 years, and the only thing that prompted him to stop was the vision of him being dead. Despite all of his goals he had for when he was sober, like getting a wife and kids or being promoted at work, none of them remotely compared to how happy he was even on the worst of his drunken days. Jimmy lifts his gun to shoot him again, and the screen flashes to the word responsibility once more. Suddenly, Jimmy is in a graveyard. When he finds a memoir of Daisuke, he realizes that he is about to engage in a gun versus axe fight with Swansea. The fight only ends when Jim shoots him 3 times. Jimmy then glitches into an open space where Curly is sitting in a chair. Jim watches a cartoon program on the TV where they're serving a cake for a Mother Goose's birthday. We, as the player, are now instructed to feast. Jimmy has to rearrange Curly's internal organs so he can properly digest a piece of his own leg that is being force-fed to him. If he fails, Curly pukes the leg back up and Jim must try again and again. Once he succeeds, he turns to the TV and he can see himself in the TV. TV Jimmy walks through a starry void before coming across Curly, who's now lit on fire. He begs to go home. Jimmy finally acknowledges to Curly that he was to blame for the crash and in turn his injuries. We then glitch back to the vents, where there is a fleshy growth and an ultrasound machine. Jimmy uses it so he can make out a distinct shape of a centipede horse-like creature. Jimmy uses it until something is birthed from it. The creature chases Jimmy through the vents as it makes a continuous crying sound. Whenever the creature catches Jimmy, the screen flashes the words, "I hope this hurts." Eventually, during the chase, Jimmy is back into another version of the cargo room. There are mountains of mouthwash all over the place, and the Pony Express logo mascot is standing on top of one of them. The pony mocks and mimics Jimmy, calling him caged and misunderstood. 0 hours before judgment. We are still Jimmy, and Curly is on the table again. Still surrounded by our dead crewmates, we pick him up and the game prompts Jimmy to go home. Jimmy brings Curly to the chiropod and places him inside. He claims that he'll finally have fixed the problem and he promises that everything is all right now. He gives the pod to Curly not because he wants to, but because this is the only way he'll be able to die guilt-free. This illustrates that he feels little to no remorse for assaulting Anya and causing the injury and in turn death of Daisuke. He feels no remorse for murdering Swansea in cold blood. He only feels like he has wronged Curly, and not even for lying and saying that Curly was the one who crashed the ship, only for causing Curly's disfigurement. The door to the pod closes as Jimmy leaves the frame and shoots himself dead. The glass fogs up, and the credits roll to the mouth-washing commercial jingle. Now, this game switches between timelines a lot, from past to present to hallucination to reality, and so I think that it's important that I quickly just summarize what actually happened on the ship. A week before the crash, Curly gets evaluated by Anya, and then evaluates Jimmy himself. Curly admits that his job feels like it isn't fulfilling enough, and the vent and utility breaks down. A day after that, Curly finds out that Pony Express is going out of business and has to inform the group. 2 days before the crash, Curly talks with Anya in the lounge, where they debrief about the screen and the pixels, and Anya asks about the locks. 1 day before the crash, Curly goes to the cockpit to find Anya freaking out, and she informs him that she is pregnant from Jimmy's baby due to sexual abuse. The day of the crash, Anya tells Jimmy that she's pregnant, and Jimmy crashes the ship. 2 months after the crash, the crew breaks into cargo only to find out that they have been shipping mouthwash and nothing useful. 5 months after the crash, Anya locks herself in medical to overdose. Daisuke and Jimmy drug Swansea. Daisuke goes to the vent and very badly hurts himself. The same day, Swansea and Jimmy try to help Daisuke, but he is near death and Swansea puts him out of his misery. Jimmy and Swansea fight to the death, and Jimmy leaves victorious by shooting Swansea dead. Jimmy then puts Curly into the pod and ends his own life. The cannibalism in the story is kind of conspired to either be metaphorical or literal. I take this very literally, considering the fact that they were on the ship for way more than they should have been, and they had no food other than sweetener and the tonic powder. So the possibility of them as a crew going and trying to eat part of the body of their living member could have very much happened, but there's no confirmation from the developers whether or not this is something that actually happened in real life or was just hallucination or symbolism for something else. Now, I'm going to talk about the true meaning and literary devices in this game. The meaning of mouthwashing is obviously up to interpretation, and what I'm about to say is simply how I interpreted the game. There's no confirmation from the developers if my assumptions are true or not, so hear everything I say knowing that these are just my thoughts and not canon. This game explores 3 primary types of conflict. Character versus environment, where it's us as the players have to deal with the looming dread of knowing that there's been a crash where people have gotten greatly injured and the ship is rapidly running out of supplies, as well as character versus character conflict, where you see the conflicts and contrasts between the characters. Despite Anya being the main victim, the true character conflict is played between Curly and Jimmy. The last type of conflict being character versus self, which can be interpreted as person versus internal guilt. Mouthwashing has a very interesting thesis. It plays with the concept that abusers are not the only antagonists. Everyone knows that people who are abusive, such as Jimmy, who abuses Anya countless times, and lies about Curly crashing the ship, are bad. But oftentimes, individuals who commit abusive and manipulative acts are not self-feeding creatures. They need someone who sees the good in them in order to feed into their own delusions that they are in the right and they aren't an awful person. This is why, yes, Jimmy is the antagonist, But he is not the only antagonist. The character we should really focus on in this story is his enabler, Captain Curly himself. As the viewer, we want to think that actively abusing someone is worse than enabling abusive behavior, but the core idea of mouthwashing puts the player into a position where they start to see enabling for what it really is, an amplification of the agony an abuser can cause to their victims. The truth is that it was Captain Curly's job to ensure everyone on the crew was safe and happy. It was Curly's job to maintain the peace. But Curly put them all at risk when he decided to offer the job to his friend Jimmy. As mentioned in the plot summary, it's implied that Jimmy has done some really bad things on Earth, and it was bad enough that it was hard for him to find employment. We never find out what he did, but considering that his actions have prevented him from job opportunities, it can be concluded that he likely has some sort of criminal record. Curly invites him onto the ship, and Jimmy's response to this is to act aggressively jealous of Curly, which is the first red flag. Curly knew that this was a huge risk, but despite that, he willingly allowed a very dangerous man into a position of power on a ship in the middle of space with a very small and intimate crew. When Anya eventually worked up enough courage to tell her captain, the man she should be able to rely on the most, that she was being assaulted by Jimmy, she was ignored and therefore invalidated. He claimed that he had known Jimmy for a long time and that this wasn't like him. In doing this and not even confronting Jimmy about his actions, he became an accomplice to Jimmy's crimes. He has officially broken his promise to protect the crew. He failed at his responsibilities, and he doesn't understand how much stepping in would have helped until after the crash. When the spacecraft crashes, Curly is left in a state where he cannot move, talk, or fight for himself. He is left at the hands of Jimmy, who has not only taken his place, but has blamed the catastrophe on Curly. Curly is put in a situation where he feels just as helpless as Anya. Jimmy is beyond cruel to Curly, and this is illustrated in the scenes where Curly is given painkillers by Jimmy. Jimmy talks to him in an intense and condescending way. He says things such as, quote, "You know what they say, pain is how we know we're still living," and "Come on, stop with the noise, damn it." And lastly, "Here we are, me in the driver's seat. Thanks for that. Open up. I hope these make you fucking feel better." The second time we play as Jimmy giving Curly his medication, we can hear him being very, very violent towards Curly in the process. I'll play some of the audio of that now. Now is when Curly truly sees the gravity of the situation he kept Anya in. Like Anya, his voice and autonomy have been completely taken away from him by Jimmy. Curly is now laying there having to stew in the guilt of allowing Jimmy onto the ship in the first place, but he is now unable to take responsibility. He has to watch Anya take her own life in front of him. She does this as a direct result of his actions, and he knows this. Yes, the assault would have always traumatized her for the rest of her life. But the fact that Curly put her in a situation where Jimmy could continuously abuse her is really what pushed her off of the edge, in my opinion. Curly was forced to watch and unable to take the responsibility that he craved to, as Anya ended her life due to his negligence. While we're on the topic of responsibility, it's important to take note one of the largest reoccurring motifs in the story, which is responsibility. Throughout the whole game, there are multiple moments when the screen flashes saying, "Take responsibility." This is shown when you're playing as both Jimmy and Curly, implying that they both have things to take responsibility for. No matter what, when you're playing as Curly, you're told to take responsibility. This is because Curly is guilty and he is aware of being guilty. He knows that he needs to make it right, but he cannot anymore because it's too late. He has enabled too much, let too much go on under his watch, and now he cannot make it right like he has always wanted to. Jimmy, on the other hand, is also told to take responsibility, but it stops. This is because he does not feel guilty. He only feels a little bit guilty for Captain Curly. He feels bad for him and can acknowledge his wrongdoings to him. I mean, that's why he let him take the chiropod. Jimmy just wants to die guilt-free, and that's an attainable goal for him, by doing the last thing he can to make it up to Curly. But this also proves that he doesn't have remorse for the other people he has wronged. When he saw that Anya had killed herself, he barely even reacted. He led Daisuke into the vent knowing that he was going to get badly injured, and he drugged Swansea to a point he very easily could have died. But none of that matters because in Jimmy's mind, he's on a higher ring of the ladder of life than everybody but Curly. This game is really interesting to me because it puts the player in the perspective where they feel like they now have to contemplate who in their lives they've been enabling unknowingly. This in and of itself is one of the true elements of horror that makes the player deeply uncomfortable. Now that I have my main interpretation of the game, I would also like to take some time to appreciate some of the amazing symbolism this game has. As I said, I've played through this game 3 times, as well as watched a playthrough to attempt to see all I can possibly see about the game. There's so much I could talk about, but there are a few main symbols that I want to cover today. If you want to hear more about the smaller symbols, let me know. I might put that in my next video too. So what I'm going to cover today are the symbols of cake, mouthwash, ladders, as well as Polly the horse. Polly the horse and horse imagery is the first one I'm going to be talking about. Polly the horse is the mascot of the company Pony Express, which, in case you didn't know, is actually a real older company where they forced orphans to work on extremely dangerous missions, because they knew that if they didn't come back alive, no one would care. All the characters feel like they have nowhere to go outside of this job. Lots of them, if they do have people who care about them, they're scared that they may lose these people without their job. For example, Swansea has been with the company forever and has built his whole life around it, and it's the only way he could financially support his wife and kids. Daisuke thinks this job is important because he craves the validation of his parents and the respect of his mother. Horses are animals that are very empathetic and emotionally intelligent. They're fragile, but they're also made to carry heavy burdens. All the characters that Jimmy hurts fit the description of a workhorse. They work hard to please and are given very little in return. This is why when he's chased by the blind horse monster in the warehouse, that in and of itself is a representation of the hurt the people Jimmy have felt. The next symbol is cake. This portion is partly inspired by a point that u/telephone-d on Reddit made on the r/mouthwashing subreddit. But the symbol of cake in mouthwashing likely comes from the idiom, you can't have your cake and eat it too. Using this point made by telephone-d, the phrase can be tied back to 2 main plot points of the gameplay, both times through Captain Curly. The first one is when Curly is forced to tell the crew that the Pony Express is dissolving. He feels attacked by everyone's reactions and hurt, despite the fact that he wants to move on from his career. The company laying them off is the best case scenario for Curly because he can move on without disappointing and abandoning his crew, but regardless, even this can't make him happy. The second one is when he decides to hire Jimmy for his crew. Curly wanted him to do good and get along with everyone, but when he realizes that Jimmy isn't the type of person to get along easily with, and Jimmy actually hurts others more than helps them, he refuses to take a stand and just disappointedly lets Jimmy abuse other members of his crew that he has sworn to protect. The next symbol is mouthwash. The mouthwash is cheaply made and it's not an effective product. It says it kills 99.9% of germs and bacteria, but it's also 14% artificial sweetener. This renders the product completely useless. It doesn't have enough substance to be food, but it's not good enough of a disinfectant to be used medically either. The product is useless, just like the trivial journey that the group was sent on. The fact that the crew is forced into a position where they have to drink mouthwash to survive is a metaphor itself. They're being forced to rely on useless products that provide them nothing positive, exactly like the crew had to rely on Curly, who was failing at his job despite putting up a front that he would care and protect for his crew. Exactly how the mouthwash falsely advertises the 99.9% effectiveness. The sugar and bullshit information Curly and Jimmy feeds the crew makes them useless leaders, and just like the mouthwash. A few people online have already talked about this, but the kills 99% might also be a subtle nod to that everyone but Curly dies on the ship. The last symbol I want to talk about is ladders. Throughout this game, Curly and Jimmy have conversation where they discuss their progress in their careers, like the rings of a ladder. Jimmy is deeply envious of how much farther up Curly is to him, so despite his respect for him, he continues to act violently to him out of spite, making snarky remarks. Ladders only ever make an appearance in the story when envy is manifesting in one of the characters. So that's all I'm going to talk about today because my mouth is bone dry. I hope you really enjoyed this video, and I am almost done writing the script for the character analysis video. If you guys are interested in hearing some of the smaller and more subtle symbols in the game, I would be more than happy to talk about that in the next part as well, so please just let me know. I really appreciate your support in watching this video, and I hope you guys all have a great day. Also, if you've not played Mouthwashing, please get it. I know you can only get it on PC, on like Windows PC, but please. Actually, funny story, I bought the game before knowing that, so I had to play it on my dad's laptop. Kind of embarrassing for me. Anyways, thank you so much. Bye-bye.